stakeholders, perhaps through a process of mapping according to level of influence and importance. Actually, I'm just going to give a quick definition of stakeholders, which they're usually defined as an individual, group or entity that has an interest in a company and its activities, may be affected by them or can have an effect on them. So just going back to my challenges, the second point is failure to choose the right engagement methods with little to no consideration given, for example, to the inclusion of vulnerable groups, a lack of effective stakeholder engagement at early stages of exploration and project development, a lack of strategic approach to an adaptive process during the life of mine. If you look at stakeholder engagement as a risk management tool, it requires regular review to make sure that it's fit for purpose. And sometimes, quite often, the case is that a stakeholder engagement plan is developed, but then the case might be that it's not reviewed over time or it's never looked at again even. No continuous process of engagement, so a few engagements may take place to inform and consult on project activities, for example, but there'll be minimal then ongoing engagement. Failure to provide effective feedback, whether that's on comments made or concerns raised by stakeholders, and a lack of capacity and support for effective stakeholder engagement in terms of human and financial resources and capacity. If you look at the diagram that is on the slide, you have noticed some stakeholder groups down. I've also included, or environment's also included as a stakeholder group, and that's because it can be affected by and have an effect on a company and its activities. Essentially, the point is that stakeholder engagement, stakeholder audience, is growing and is driven by purpose and change. And I'll touch upon this again in another slide. So since the SDGs came into the spotlight, there's been the growing appreciation that there's been the growing appreciation that meeting the target set requires the support of the private sector, whether this is in terms of finance or expertise or technological support and research. This acknowledgement has been reflected in increase in interest or discussions or discourse even around impact investment, socially responsible investment, and blended finance as well. So there's the expectation that companies align their community development strategies at achieving social outcomes that mesh with global public priorities. Companies are incorporating these 17 goals into their broader sustainability strategy and producing sustainability reports as well. There's also an investment justification with the growing interest, obviously, as has been discussed by numerous people in this conference, growing interest in ESG from institutional investors in particular to show that companies are investing in solutions, not problems, and pursuing financial success in a way that yields benefits to society. It would be fair to say then that running in parallel and fueling this change at the same time is a growing stakeholder audience who have increasing expectations and are a catalyst for change. There's growing global demand from these stakeholders, whether that's shareholders, consumers, employees, and the wider society, for transparency in the value chain of companies. They expect to see reporting of non-financial information that's reliable, easily understandable, and consistent from companies. And all of this is putting increased pressure then on them. So building on my last point and moving on to drivers of change, we have civil society, firstly thanks to social media. Communities and other stakeholder groups have greater access to information than ever before. About not only the negative consequences of mining, but the positive ones as well. Secondly, there's the online proliferation of information at people's fingertips. This is known as hyper-transparency, and it means that companies have less control over external content and can no longer control the timing or content of information about them that's released. Thirdly, communities are made up, and I think it's quite important to occasionally remind ourselves that a community is not a homogenous group, but actually made up of individuals with agency. And they have a greater level of awareness and understanding of their rights. They have improved access to NGOs and CSOs to support them. They're demanding more and holding companies to account for not following through on their commitments. That leads me on to my next point about the concept of localization, and to appreciate the importance of local knowledge and solutions to local problems. And linked to this is local content and local content requirements, which are policies imposed by governments that require firms to produce domestically manufactured goods or domestically supplied services. Most mines spend more money on procurement of goods and services than they do on taxes, employee salaries, and community investment combined. So it's quite important to appreciate the massive potential for economic and social development at a local and national level. This does require corporate thinking to move away from seeing communities as beneficiaries and to appreciate the assets that exist in the community as resources for building sustainability. Running parallel to this, and especially in the context of what I've been talking about, as stakeholder and consumer concerns have grown, and with the UN guiding principles as which provide a meaningful framework, supply chain oversight has emerged as a critical corporate priority as well. Another driver is the ongoing discussions at a global level on the need to tackle inequality and to ensure equity and inclusion in interventions in order to reduce poverty. Mining activities have the potential to exacerbate inequalities and to exclude vulnerable groups, but as a driver of development, companies are provided with the opportunity to ensure that gender equality and the inclusion of other vulnerable groups is mainstreamed in their interventions and considered in their activities. At the risk of oversimplification, I've grouped a number of other items and drivers here because they're interconnected, they're systematic, and they create a complex environment to operate in. And for example, climate change, from a very basic humanitarian lens, can expose vulnerabilities, exacerbate inequalities, and add fuel to existing crises. Employee effect. I've added this one as one of the obstacles in the that the industry is facing in terms of either people leaving the industry or attracting new recruits, because there is the acknowledgement that public perception and negative attitudes towards the sector can be changed if the industry demonstrates how it's addressing issues that are of concern to society and stakeholders. Well, and this is ranging from as well. So in terms of what the future of stakeholder engagement is looking like, what I will say is that there's more consideration given to the purpose and depth of engagement. Transparency is definitely key in this. Hyper-transparency means that companies themselves need to be more proactively transparent from the outset. Companies also need to champion transparency through substantive engagement by tackling difficult and often neglected topics such as mine closure or social transitioning. It's important for companies together with stakeholders to begin with the end in mind, which in this case is future sustainability of mining communities. For this reason, engagement with a particular group of stakeholders, whether it's communities, local government, needs to take a step beyond, simply ticking a box to looking at objectives of equality, sustainability, and shared values as well. And I just want to link to this the idea that it needs to be rights-led. It needs to go simply beyond informing them about the project and having a one-off consultation with them. It needs to, or one of the other things that I want to mention is an increasing consideration by governments to undertake either a human rights impact assessment or a gender impact assessment, which gives the opportunity for project impacts to be looked at through a human rights lens or a gender lens. And both of them require extensive and meaningful stakeholder engagement with specific groups that are inherently inclusive. Building partnerships is a way of addressing the complex and systematic challenges that I mentioned in the previous slide. For example, stakeholder climate change, or an increase in extremism, for example, or the issue of human rights. And it needs to be transformational by looking at the broader environment. So perhaps rather than looking only at direct stakeholders, also consider indirect stakeholders. And the other thing, which I won't touch on for too long, is that it's all about early engagement, and it was talked about quite a lot actually by in a presentation yesterday, and the importance of engagement at exploration stage and the benefits that they can bring in terms of the future development of the mine. And just quickly on my last point, I just want to emphasize that it's not easy. Effective stakeholder
We're being lucky today with the internet. I'm going to give her another few seconds. Are you back? Yes, you're back. Fantastic. Keep going.
Oh, I finished. Where did you get to?
Your last point.
How have I was a little bit panicky during it because I thought I'd lost the internet connection. Sorry. My last point was how stakeholder engagement of the future is not necessarily going to be easy, because things to consider are that it's expensive, it takes time, it requires a continuous process. That was it, actually.
Beautiful. Thank you very, very much, and well done for getting to the end there. So massive round of applause from all of us behind our microphones. And we do have a couple of questions for you, if that's okay, Insiya. Is that okay for us to ask you a couple of questions?
Yeah, hopefully my internet will be okay.
Yeah, so, well, if not, I can take a go at trying to answer some of them, which would be a disaster for everybody. But the first question that we have for you that comes from Jane, and what she asks is, what kind of methods are there to demonstrate good stakeholder engagement?
That's a good question. Well, I think the easy answer to that is the evidence of, or the maintaining of a social license. Well, that's the easy answer. A more detailed one would be, well, as long as there is sufficient data management in terms of the stakeholder engagement and sufficient record keeping, there'll be qualitative and quantitative information that can be looked at, such as how many engagements have taken place, whether there's been effective remediation of any concerns or grievances raised, the extent and the variety of stakeholders that are being engaged with. And on another level, it'll be it's what another thing that would be interesting to look at in terms of how effective it's been is what was the purpose of the engagement in the first place. So if they have effective monitoring and evaluation to see how effective community development programs have been, for example, and what kind of change in impact indicators, what the change in that has been. So evidence of that as well.
Brilliant, thank you for that. And one final question, if I may, and this comes from Sandra. And Sandra asks or says, in my country, there is a strong movement against mining that is not necessarily that easily understandable. They have said that they don't accept the word stakeholder. Is there any other approach, or is there any other place with this kind of feeling?
Is there any other examples where there has been a rejection of the term?
Yes, yeah.
No, not that I'm aware of, but I guess I would have a question in response to that, and that's whether, so I guess a clarification would be good, is whether they reject being identified as stakeholders or whether they reject the definition of a stakeholder.
Yeah, and this is something here. So I think Sandra makes a really good point, and there are lots of other words that are used instead of stakeholder. And so, for example, in a lot of the ISO standards, you now see interested party instead of the word stakeholder.
Yeah, that's quite often used, interested and affected parties.
Yeah. So this is something here where, thank you so much, Insiya. That was absolutely fantastic. Apologies for your internet. I'm sure it will perk up.
It was fine all the way through, I felt, until it was the time for my presentation.
But brilliant, thank you very much. And if we could all put our hands together on our sides of the microphones to say thank you very much for a brilliant talk from yourself. Brilliant. Okay.